Did Elvis Presley really set off firecrackers in the middle of a recording session? Could a multi-million-dollar recording be halted because of a simple water pistol? And was the legendary laughing version of Are You Lonesome Tonight an accident or the result of a deliberate prank? The pristine sound on those classic records hides a world of chaos, humor, and boyish mischief. The studio was Elvis's clubhouse, and when the pressure got too high or the boredom set in, the king became the court jester. These aren't just stories of goofs. They are stories about how a man, trapped by his own fame, used humor to control his world, connect with his friends, and, sometimes, make incredible music happen by accident. And number 19 was Laughter the Only Way to Salvage a Song. A UN hit single was almost derailed by a backup singer's wig. The session cost for that one night exceeded $10,000 in 1969, equivalent to over $75,000 today. The take that ultimately fell apart, Take 6, is now more famous among collectors than the officially released master. It was never intended for public release, and the song was Suspicious Minds. The place was American Sound Studio in Memphis. The date was January 23rd, 1969. The session was dragging. They had been working on the song for hours, from 4 in the morning until after sunrise. Elvis was tired. The band was tired. The producer, Chips Moman, was a perfectionist and demanded take after take. The atmosphere, which had started electric, was becoming a grind. Elvis needed a release valve. He found it in Charlie Hodge. And Charlie was a constant presence, a friend from his army days. He sang harmony, played acoustic guitar, and handed Elvis his scarves and water on stage. He was also a frequent target of Elvis's humor. On this particular morning, Charlie was providing vocal harmony, and his energy was just as drained as everyone else's. During a break, Elvis started kidding him. It was lighthearted at first, but Elvis had a knack for escalating things. As they prepared for another take, Elvis couldn't let it go. He started making faces at Charlie. He'd cross his eyes during a serious lyric. He'd mouth exaggerated words. Charlie tried to stay professional. He was standing near the other backup singers, Donna, Jean, Godcho, and Mary Holiday, trying to focus on his part. But Elvis was relentless. The moment came during the bridge. It's the part of the song that builds, full of tension and release. Elvis sang his lead vocal, and then it was time for the powerful backing vocals to come in. Just as they did, Elvis reached over and gave Charlie a playful shove. It wasn't hard, but it was unexpected. Charlie, exhausted and off balance, stumbled. This was the crack in the dam. Elvis started to giggle. It wasn't a full laugh, just a little chuckle that he tried to suppress. He got through the next line, but he kept looking at Charlie, who was trying desperately not to laugh back. The musicians felt the shift. The solid groove they had been locked into for hours started to waver. Our bassist, Mike Leach, glanced over at drummer Gene Chrisman, a slight smile on his face. They knew what was coming. This wasn't the first time an Elvis session had been torpedoed by a fit of the giggles. Elvis sang another line, but his voice was shaking with suppressed laughter. He then fully committed to the prank. He started improvising lyrics, singing nonsense words about Charlie's hair or his shirt. The professionalism in the room evaporated. The Jordanaires, seasoned pros who had been with Elvis for years, broke down. One of them let out a loud snort. That was it. The session collapsed into chaos. Elvis doubled over, laughing so hard he couldn't stand. The priceless studio microphones picked up the sound of a room full of grown men crying with laughter. Chips Moman from the control booth was less amused. He was on the clock. Every minute of wasted tape cost money. He pressed the button for the talkback microphone. Elvis, we got a good one going here. Can we keep it? His voice was tight. Elvis, wiping tears from his eyes, tried to compose himself. Yeah, Chips. I'm sorry. Let's do it again. But the mood was broken. It took another 15 minutes for everyone to calm down enough to attempt another take. The energy was different now. The tension was gone. The next few takes were loose, more relaxed, and in that new, lighter atmosphere, they nailed the master take. The version of Suspicious Minds that went to number 1 was born directly out of the ashes of a take destroyed by laughter. The prank, which seemed like a costly diversion, had actually been the key. It reset the room and allowed the magic to happen. The failed take, full of laughter, and nonsense became a legendary bootleg, a secret glimpse into the real Elvis, the one who sometimes needed to be a class clown more than a king. Number 18, how do you record a power ballad with a gun? A blank firing pistol was a standard piece of equipment at many Elvis recording sessions in the 1970s. The sound of a gunshot on an unreleased take of I Just Can't Help Believin' was not an added sound effect. It was real. Band members learned to distinguish the sound of the studio's backfire from Elvis's pistol. It was June 1970. Elvis was in Nashville at RCA's Studio B. This was a legendary room, but for this series of sessions, it was Elvis's playground. He was recording a marathon of songs for his next few albums. The pressure was immense. The record company wanted hits. Colonel Tom Parker wanted product to sell. Elvis just wanted to have some fun. His newest toy was a small pistol that fired blanks. It was loud. In the controlled acoustic environment of a recording studio, it was deafening. He loved the shock value. He would wait for the quietest, most intense moment of a song, and then he would fire it into the air. The explosion would rattle the microphones and jolt every musician out of their concentration. On this particular day, they were working on I Just Can't Help Believin', a soft, heartfelt ballad. The arrangement was delicate. It required focus from everyone. James Burton was playing his intricate acoustic guitar parts. The orchestra was laying down lush string arrangements. Elvis was in the vocal booth, giving a tender, emotional performance. They were on the third or fourth take. Everyone was in the zone. The song reached the final verse. It's a quiet moment before the big finale. Elvis's voice was barely a whisper. The musicians were holding their breath. And then, bang. The sound was sharp, violent. It was completely out of place. Ronnie Tutt, the drummer, later said he nearly fell off his stool. The string players all jumped. The take was obviously ruined. From the control room, producer Felton Jarvis sighed and hit the talkback. Elvis? What was that? There was a pause, and then Elvis's voice came through the speakers, laced with laughter. Just keeping everybody awake, Felton. For the musicians, this was part of the job. They were paid well, but they had to put up with the king's whims. Some found it frustrating. It broke their focus and wasted time. Others saw it as Elvis's way of dealing with the pressure. He was a perfectionist in his own way. He knew when a take wasn't quite right, when the magic wasn't there. Sometimes, instead of just saying, let's do it again, he would blow it up spectacularly. It was his form of control. He ended the take on his terms. The gunshot prank was more than just a startling noise. It was a statement. It reminded everyone in the room who was in charge. The producer, the engineers, the session musicians, they were all experts in their fields. But Elvis was the star. The session began when he arrived and ended when he left. The rules of a normal recording session didn't apply. If he wanted to fire a gun in the middle of a ballad, nobody could stop him. The practice became so common that the band developed a sort of gallows humor about it. They would place bets on which song he would shoot. They learned to anticipate it. If a take was going too perfectly, or if Elvis seemed bored, they would brace themselves. It was a strange, tense way to make music. But it was the only way Elvis knew. He had to create his own little bubble of chaos to feel comfortable. The recordings from those sessions are often polished and beautiful, but buried in the studio archives are the outtakes, punctuated by loud bangs and the king's mischievous laughter. Number 17, could water really destroy a masterpiece? A Neumann U47 microphone, the gold standard of studio recording, cost over $4,000 in the 1960s, the price of a new car. At least 3 of these microphones were directly hit during water pistol fights at RCA Studio B. The tape machines, which cost even more, were often covered with tarps by frantic engineers when the fighting began. The year was 1966. Elvis was in Nashville, grinding through a soundtrack recording for one of his movies. The songs were, for the most part, uninspired. It was formulaic music for formulaic films. Elvis was bored. He was a rock and roll pioneer, being forced to sing songs like Yoga Is as Yoga Does. His creative spirit was being crushed by contractual obligations. To combat the soul-crushing boredom, he turned the studio into a war zone. His weapons of choice were high-powered water pistols. Not the cheap little plastic ones, but the kind that could shoot a stream of water 20 feet across the room. He bought them for everyone. The Memphis Mafia, the musicians, anyone who was in the studio was fair game. The sessions would start normally. They would run through a song a few times, but inevitably someone would get a restless look in their eye. Elvis would catch it. He'd give a subtle nod. That was the signal. Suddenly, from behind amplifiers and music stands, the water pistols would appear. The studio, a space designed for sonic perfection, would erupt into chaos. Musicians would dive for cover, trying to protect their priceless vintage guitars and basses. The engineers in the control booth would watch in horror through the glass. Their main concern was the microphones. A direct hit on a vintage tube microphone could short it out, destroying it instantly. These weren't easily replaceable. On one occasion, they were recording a ballad. The lights were low, the mood was serious. Elvis was in the vocal booth, singing with genuine emotion. The Jordanaires were gathered around a single microphone, laying down their smooth, perfect harmonies. From the side, guitarist Jerry Reed, a notorious prankster himself, saw his chance. He slowly raised his water pistol and took aim at the back of Gordon Stoker, the lead tenor for the Jordanaires, which he fired. The stream of water hit Stoker right in the neck. Stoker, a consummate professional, yelped and jumped, singing a note that was definitely not in the arrangement. The other Jordanaires scattered. The water had also sprayed across the U-47 microphone they were all singing into. In the control booth, engineer Bill Porter shouted into the talkback, "Hold it! Hold it! The mic is wet." The session ground to a halt. Porter had to come out with a towel and carefully dry the microphone, hoping it wasn't permanently damaged. Elvis thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen. He was laughing so hard he had to sit down. The water fights were a symptom of a deeper problem. Elvis was creatively stifled. He couldn't challenge the Colonel or the movie studios, so he took control of his immediate environment. He couldn't change the songs he had to sing, but he could change the atmosphere in which he sang them. If he had to sing a dumb song, he was going to do it while having a water gun fight. It was an act of rebellion. It was his way of saying, this might be your movie and your song, but this is my session, my studio, my rules. The engineers may have been terrified for their equipment, but for Elvis, it was a way to survive the creative desert of his mid-60s movie career. Number 16, what did M&Ms have to do with recording a hit? Elvis Presley's studio snack demands were legendary, often including specific items like burnt bacon, meatloaf, and Pepsi in glass bottles. One of his most famous requests was a bowl of M&Ms, but with a specific unspoken rule. Any attempt to mess with the snack table was considered a serious offense. The scene is radio recorders in Hollywood, late 1950s. Elvis is at the peak of his initial fame. He is recording music for films like Jailhouse Rock or King Creole. These sessions were intense, high-pressure affairs. The studio was booked for a specific block of time, and they had to produce a specific number of songs. To keep his energy up, Elvis had a table of snacks and drinks set up in the studio. It was his personal fuel station. Everyone in the band and crew knew the rules: don't touch Elvis's stuff unless offered, especially the Pepsi. He had a very specific way he liked it, ice cold in a short glass. One of the younger members of the Memphis Mafia, not yet wise to the unwritten laws of the studio, thought it would be funny to play a little prank. He saw the bowl of M&Ms sitting on the table next to Elvis's chair. While Elvis was in the vocal booth, the young man snuck over and carefully, painstakingly picked out all of the brown M&Ms. And he left all the other colors. It was a subtle, silly joke. A few minutes later, Elvis finished a take and came out for a break. He walked over to the snack table, reached for the bowl of M&Ms, and froze. He stared into the bowl. The room went silent. The musicians, who had noticed the prank, held their breath. They knew Elvis's temper could be unpredictable. Elvis looked up from the bowl, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't say a word. He just looked at each person, one by one. His gaze was intense. The young prankster felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He was expecting an explosion. Instead, Elvis slowly turned his head towards producer Jerry Lieber. "Jerry," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're done for the day." Lieber was stunned. "Elvis, we have 3 more songs to do. We're booked until midnight." Elvis just shook his head. "Nope, I can't work like this. He picked up his jacket and walked out of the studio. The session was over. The prank had cost the record company thousands of dollars in lost studio time. The musicians, who were paid by the session, lost a day's pay. The young member of the mafia was read the riot act by the older, more experienced guys. This wasn't just about candy. For Elvis, the studio was his sanctuary, the one place he could control every detail. The snack table was part of that control. He had it set up exactly how he wanted it. The M&M prank, as trivial as it seemed, was a violation of his space. It was a disruption of his ritual. In his mind, if he couldn't control something as simple as his snack bowl, how could he control the complex process of creating a hit record? It was an overreaction, but it was a revealing one. It showed a side of Elvis that the public never saw, the man who needed absolute order in his immediate surroundings to function creatively. The next day, he returned to the studio. A fresh bowl of M&Ms with all colors present was on the table, and the session continued as if nothing had happened. The message, however, had been received by everyone. Number 15, why would you throw a firecracker in a room full of geniuses? Cherry bombs and M80 firecrackers were a constant presence in Elvis's travel bags from the late 1960s onward. An M80, which is a Class C explosive, can produce a sound of 170 decibels, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage. Studio B in Nashville had acoustics so sensitive you could hear a pin drop from across the room. It was the summer of 1970. The Nashville sessions were producing some of Elvis's best work in years, including tracks for the Elvis Country album. The band was a collection of the finest session musicians in the world, known as the Nashville Cats. Men like guitarist Chip Young and pianist David Briggs. These were serious musicians dedicated to their craft. Elvis, however, was in a playful and often disruptive mood. He had discovered the joy of powerful firecrackers. He loved the element of surprise, the shock, the momentary chaos they created. He would carry them in the pockets of his custom-made jumpsuits. One evening, they were working on a complex arrangement. The mood was studious. The musicians were concentrating on their charts. And Elvis was in the main room with them, not in an isolated vocal booth. He preferred the live, connected feel of singing with the band. He was sitting on a stool, listening to a playback. He had a mischievous glint in his eye that the experienced members of his entourage had learned to fear. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a cherry bomb, and lit the fuse with his lighter. He casually tossed it under the grand piano where David Briggs was sitting. Briggs was a quiet, reserved man, completely absorbed in the music. He had no idea what was coming. The explosion was immense in the enclosed space. It wasn't just a pop. It was a physical concussion of sound. Briggs leaped off the piano bench as if he'd been electrocuted. The strings of the piano vibrated wildly from the blast, creating a discordant, chaotic noise that was picked up by all the microphones. The take they were listening to was instantly forgotten. The room was filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. For a moment there was stunned silence, then Elvis's booming laugh filled the room. He thought it was hilarious. The musicians were not as amused. Their ears were ringing. Their nerves were shot. This wasn't just a prank, it was a physical assault on their senses, the very senses they used to make a living. And Felton Jarvis, the producer, came over the talkback. His voice was weary. "Elvis, please." The piano. The expensive studio piano could have been damaged. More importantly, the trust and focus of the musicians had been shattered. But no one would ever directly challenge Elvis. To do so was to risk being fired or, worse, exiled from his inner circle. So they took a break, they let their ears stop ringing, they waited for the smoke to clear, and then they went back to work. But the atmosphere was different. There was an undercurrent of tension. The musicians were now on edge, half expecting another explosion at any moment. This prank revealed the duality of Elvis in the studio. On one hand, he was a gifted and intuitive musician who could lead the band to incredible performances. On the other, he was a man-child who needed constant amusement and would go to extreme lengths to get it, even if it meant terrorizing the very people who were helping him create his art. The firecrackers were his way of shaking things up, of reminding everyone that he was not just another singer. He was Elvis Presley, and the normal rules did not apply. Number 14, could go-karts and music making really mix? The RCA studio complex in Hollywood had a large paved backlot, originally designed for parking and loading equipment. During the mid-1960s, this lot was converted into a makeshift racetrack, an average of 3 times a week. The cost of a new go-kart in 1965 was around $200, more than a week's salary for the average American. Elvis bought 8 of them. The mid-1960s were Elvis's movie years. He was churning out film after film, and each one required a soundtrack. The recording sessions for these soundtracks often took place at RCA Studios on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. The music was often unchallenging, and the process became repetitive and boring for Elvis. To break the monotony, he brought his hobbies to work. His latest obsession was go-karting. He didn't just buy one, he bought a whole fleet so that his friends in the band could race with him. The backlot of the studio became the Presley Speedway. A typical session day would begin with a few hours of work. They would lay down the tracks for songs that would end up in movies like Harem Scarum or Paradise, Hawaiian Style. But as soon as Elvis felt his energy or interest waning, he would call a break. This wasn't a 10-minute coffee break. It was a 2-hour go-karting Grand Prix. He would lead the charge out to the backlot where the carts were lined up and ready to go. The Memphis Mafia, the musicians, and even some of the studio staff would join in. They would race around the lot, engines buzzing, tires screeching. It was loud, chaotic, and probably a nightmare for the other artists trying to record in adjacent studios. These races were not just for fun, they were highly competitive. Elvis was a notoriously aggressive driver. He would bump other carts, cut people off, and do whatever it took to win. It was another arena where he could be the king. The studio executives were torn. On one hand, the delays were costing them money. A recording session had a fixed cost per hour, whether music was being made or not. The go-karting breaks added thousands of dollars to the budget of each soundtrack. On the other hand, they knew they had to keep their star happy. A happy Elvis was a productive Elvis. If go-karts were what it took to get him through another uninspired song about clams or beach parties, then it was a price they were willing to pay. The musicians had mixed feelings. Some, like guitarist Scotty Moore, were older and had little interest in racing around a parking lot. They would sit on the sidelines, waiting for the fun to be over so they could get back to work. Others, especially the younger guys, embraced the chaos. It was a chance to blow off steam and see a different side of their boss. The go-karting sessions are a perfect metaphor for this era of Elvis's career. He was on autopilot, musically, but he was desperately seeking excitement and distraction in his personal life. He turned the professional workspace into his personal playground. The music they made was often forgettable, but the memories of those wild races in the studio backlot stuck with everyone who was there. It was a bizarre fusion of commerce and chaos, a testament to the strange world that had been built around a single star. Number 13. What happens when the king gets a bullhorn? A standard police bullhorn can amplify a voice to over 100 decibels. The ideal volume for communication between a control room and the studio floor is around 70 decibels. Elvis used his bullhorn, not for communication, but for comedic commentary, often during the most sensitive moments of recording. The setting was again RCA Studio B in Nashville, but this time during the early 1970s, Elvis was in a creatively fertile period, but his methods were becoming more and more eccentric. He had decided he needed a bullhorn, the kind used by police or movie directors. He had one of his guys go out and buy one. He wouldn't use it to talk to the producer in the control booth. He wouldn't use it to give musical directions. He used it as a tool for mischief. He would wait until the band was deep into a take, playing a quiet, intricate part. The red recording light would be on. Total silence was required from everyone not playing an instrument. Then, from his corner of the studio, Elvis would lift the bullhorn to his lips. He would press the button and, in a deafeningly loud, distorted voice, say something completely absurd. It might be, "James Burton, your guitar is out of tune." Or he would make a loud siren noise. Or he would just yell, "Hey!" The effect was instantaneous and devastating to the recording. The sensitive microphones would pick up the distorted blast from the bullhorn, rendering the take useless. The musicians would flinch, lose their place in the music, and the whole performance would fall apart. From Elvis's perspective, it was pure comedy. He loved the power of it, the ability to stop everything with the push of a button. He would watch the musicians' reactions and howl with laughter. For him, it was a way to break the tension and keep things from getting too serious or stuffy. For the other people in the room, it was a source of immense frustration. Producer Felton Jarvis would often plead with him over the talkback. "Elvis, man, we almost had it. Please put the bullhorn down." But Elvis would just laugh and promise to be good, a promise he would keep for maybe 10 minutes before picking it up again. This wasn't just random noise-making, it was also a bizarre form of producing. Sometimes his bullhorn comments would actually contain a useful piece of direction, albeit delivered in the most disruptive way possible. He might yell, "Ronnie, more drums on the chorus." It was a chaotic and inefficient way to communicate, but it was his way. He disliked the formal separation of the control room and the studio floor. He wanted to be in the middle of the action, directing the band like a field general, and the bullhorn was his eccentric baton. The bullhorn prank highlights the strange power dynamic in the studio. In any other recording session, a singer who behaved this way would be reprimanded or even thrown out. But with Elvis, the opposite was true. The entire multi-million-dollar recording industry had to adapt to his whims. Engineers learned to be quick with the mute button. Musicians learned to ignore the sudden blasts of noise. They all understood that making records with Elvis meant entering his world, a world where a police bullhorn was considered a perfectly reasonable studio instrument. Number 12, did a rubber chicken have a recording credit? The presence of gag toys became common in the studio during Elvis's jumpsuit era of the 1970s. These included whoopee cushions, fake arrows through the head, and, most famously, a rubber chicken. The chicken made its first appearance during the Stax studio sessions in Memphis in 1973. By 1973, Elvis's recording sessions had become elaborate affairs, often involving a full orchestra, multiple backup singers, and his core rhythm section. The sessions at Stax Records in his hometown of Memphis were particularly fraught with tension. Elvis was not in a good place personally, and his mood swings were unpredictable. To lighten the atmosphere, or perhaps just to amuse himself, he started bringing gag items to the studio. One day, he showed up with a classic squeaky rubber chicken. It became his new favorite toy. He would carry it around the studio with him, placing it in unexpected places. One of its favorite perches was on top of the grand piano. Pianist Bobby Wood would be trying to play a serious emotional chord progression for a song like My Boy, and he would look up to see the rubber chicken staring blankly at him. Elvis would be watching from the corner, a smirk on his face, waiting for Bobby to break. The chicken wasn't just a visual gag. It was an auditory one, too. Elvis discovered its squeak was loud enough to be picked up by the studio microphones. He would wait for a quiet moment in a song, a pause between vocal lines, and he would give the chicken a sharp squeeze. The sudden comical squeak would echo through the studio monitors, destroying the emotional integrity of the song. On one outtake from the Stax sessions, you can hear them attempting a take of a somber ballad. The music is beautiful. Elvis's voice is rich and full of feeling. He sings a line, and then, in the silence that follows, a faint but unmistakable squeak is heard. The band immediately stops playing. You can hear someone say, "Damn it, Elvis," followed by the King's uncontrollable laughter. This may seem like simple, childish behavior, but it was more complex than that. The Stax sessions were difficult. The material was dark and emotional, dealing with themes of heartbreak and loss, mirroring his own life at the time with his recent separation from Priscilla. The music was hitting a little too close to home. The rubber chicken was a defense mechanism. It was his way of keeping the raw emotion of the songs at arm's length. When a performance became too real, too painful, he would use the chicken to shatter the mood. It was a way of creating distance, of turning a moment of genuine vulnerability into a joke. He was using comedy to protect himself from his own art. The crew and the band grew to accept the chicken as just another member of the entourage. It was a symbol of the surreal environment that was an Elvis Presley recording session in the 1970s. It was a place where incredible, heartfelt music was created, but where the process could be derailed at any moment by the squeak of a cheap rubber toy. Number 11, who was the Phantom Fifth Beatle in the studio? Impersonations were a key part of Elvis's offstage persona. but he rarely did them on record. However, during the Marathon Nashville sessions of 1970, he began impersonating other artists mid-take, often to the confusion of the band. His favorite targets were Dean Martin, Tom Jones, and his own guitarist, James Burton. The date is June 4th, 1970. The band is assembled in Studio B. They are more than just a backing band. They are a supergroup of session players. James Burton on lead guitar, Jerry Sheff on bass, Ronnie Tutt on drums, and Glenn D. Harden on piano. This was the core of what would become the TCB band. They were tight, professional, and incredibly fast at learning new material. Elvis was in a strange mood. He was energized and creative, but also easily distracted. They were working on a country song. The groove was set. The tape was rolling. Elvis started singing the first verse in his own unmistakable voice. But when he got to the second verse, a different voice came out of the monitors. It was a smooth, slightly slurring baritone. He was doing a spot on impersonation of Dean Martin. The band was momentarily confused. Sheff and Tutt exchanged a look. Was this a joke? Were they supposed to stop? They decided to keep playing to see where he was going with it. Elvis sang the entire second verse as Dean Martin. Then, for the chorus, he switched back to his own voice. For the guitar solo, he started making comments in a high-pitched, comical voice, imitating what he thought James Burton would say. The take was, of course, unusable for the final record. But it was an interesting moment. Elvis was using impersonation as a way to play with the song, to explore it from different angles. It was also a way for him to show off his deep knowledge of other singers' styles. He wasn't just a rock and roller, he was a student of all kinds of music. On another occasion, during the same series of sessions, they were recording a big, powerful ballad. The song had a dramatic, show-stopping feel, similar to the material Tom Jones was famous for at the time. In the middle of a powerful vocal take, Elvis suddenly shifted his phrasing and vibrato, launching into a full-blown Tom Jones impersonation. He hit the high notes with the same explosive power, adopting the Welsh singer's signature swagger. The band loved it. It was a moment of levity, but it was also impressive. You know, he wasn't mocking these singers, he was paying tribute to them in his own unique way. He was acknowledging their talent and, in a way, measuring himself against them. This habit of mid-take impersonation was also a subtle power play. It was Elvis reminding the band, the producer, and himself that he was more than just the voice on the record. He was an entertainer, a performer with a wide range of tools at his disposal. He could be the sensitive balladeer, the gritty bluesman, or for a few moments he could even be Dino. It kept the sessions unpredictable and reminded everyone that, while they were there to make records, they were also there to be part of the Elvis Presley show, a show that could change direction at any moment. Number 10. How did a dirty joke end up on a Wone record? The famous long version of Are You Lonesome Tonight was recorded on August 26, 1969 at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. It was not a studio recording, but a live concert recording. The official story is that Elvis started laughing when a backup singer sang off key. The real story is much funnier and involves a bald man in the front row. While not strictly a studio goof, this is perhaps the most famous example of Elvis breaking character during a performance. The song Are You Lonesome Tonight was a sacred cow. It was a huge hit for him in 1960, a dramatic, spoken word ballad that his female fans adored. He was expected to perform it with complete seriousness. During this particular show in Las Vegas, he was in a silly mood. The pressure of the Vegas engagement was intense, and he often used humor to cope. As he began the song, everything was normal. He sang the opening verses beautifully. Then he got to the spoken word part, the monologue in the middle of the song. He delivered the first few lines with his usual dramatic flair. I wonder if you're lonesome tonight. Then he looked out at the audience. In the front row, a man had taken off his toupee and was polishing his bald head with a napkin. The sight was so absurd, so out of place during this serious moment that Elvis started to lose it. He tried to continue the monologue. Do you gaze at your doorstep and picture me there? As he said the word there, a small giggle escaped. He tried to cover it by clearing his throat, but it was too late. The audience, sensing his amusement, started to chuckle. That only made it worse. He tried the next line, but his voice was shaking with laughter. He then saw his backup singer, Sissy Houston, who was also watching the bald man and trying not to laugh. Their eyes met, and they both broke down. What happened next became legendary. Instead of stopping the song, Elvis leaned into the chaos. He started improvising the lyrics. He changed, do you gaze at your bald head and wish you had hair, to something similar. The audience roared. The band could barely keep playing. On the recording, you can hear the bass player laughing so hard he's missing notes. Elvis was crying with laughter, unable to speak. Sissy Houston, trying to be helpful, sang her backup line, "I'm so sorry, my dear," but her voice was also cracking up. This just sent Elvis into another fit of giggles. He eventually managed to pull himself together enough to finish the song, but the original mood was long gone. RCA decided to release the recording as a single in the UK years later. It became a massive hit, reaching #1 on the charts. People loved it because it was a rare, unguarded moment. It was the king, the perfect idol, showing a human, flawed, and hilarious side. The prank wasn't intentional, but his reaction to it, his willingness to share the joke with the audience rather than get angry or embarrassed, turned a mistake into one of the most beloved recordings of his career. It was a happy accident born from a bald head and Elvis's inability to keep a straight face. Number 9 was Sabotage, a Form of Affection. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's inner circle of friends and employees, were not just prank victims, they were also perpetrators. The pranks they played on Elvis had to be subtle and carefully planned. A direct prank could result in exile. The safest target was always his food or drink. The studio was always stocked with an endless supply of Pepsi Cola, Elvis's favorite drink. He drank it constantly during sessions. He had a specific way he liked it, poured from a glass bottle into a small glass filled with crushed ice. Everyone knew not to mess with the Pepsi, but one night at American Sound Studio in Memphis, someone dared to. It was likely Lamar Fike, a large man with a wicked sense of humor and one of the few people who could get away with pranking Elvis. While Elvis was in the middle of a vocal take, Lamar crept over to the table where a fresh Pepsi had just been poured for him. He took out a salt shaker and emptied a significant amount into the glass. He stirred it quickly so the salt dissolved, then slipped away. Elvis finished the take, which had gone well. He was in a good mood. He walked over to the table, picked up the glass, and took a big gulp. His face immediately changed. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, and disgust. He sputtered, spitting the salt-laced Pepsi onto the floor. The room fell silent. Everyone looked at Elvis. His eyes narrowed, and he scanned the faces of everyone in the room. He was looking for the guilty party. He knew it had to be one of his guys. The musicians wouldn't dare. The studio staff wouldn't dare. His eyes landed on Lamar Fike, who was trying and failing to look innocent. A slow smile spread across Elvis's face. He started to laugh. It was a genuine deep belly laugh. He wasn't angry. He was impressed. Someone had finally managed to get him back. This incident reveals a lot about the dynamic within his circle. The pranks were a form of communication. They were a way for the guys to test the boundaries, to have a little bit of power in a world where Elvis had all of it. A successful prank on the king was a badge of honor. It was also a sign of affection. You only played jokes on the people you were comfortable with. For Elvis, being the target of a harmless prank like this was a sign that his friends weren't just yes men. It broke the monotony of being constantly deferred to. For that one moment when he tasted the salty Pepsi, he wasn't the king of rock and roll. He was just a guy whose friend had played a funny trick on him. And in the isolated world he lived in, that brief moment of normalcy was something he secretly craved. Number 8. Why did a sacred song cause unholy laughter? Elvis's gospel recordings were some of the most important and heartfelt music he ever made. The sessions for his gospel albums, like How Great Thou Art, were often more focused and serious than his rock or pop sessions. However, they were not immune to his sense of humor. An outtake of the song Farther Along famously dissolves into chaos. It was 1966. Elvis was in Nashville recording the How Great Thou Art album. This was a passion project for him. He loved gospel music more than any other genre. He had brought in his favorite gospel group, the Imperials, to sing backup. The mood in the studio was respectful, almost reverent. They began working on Farther Along, a classic gospel standard. The arrangement was simple and beautiful. Elvis and the Imperials were gathered around the microphones, blending their voices. The first few takes were good but lacked a certain spark. On the next take, something went wrong. It's not clear exactly what happened first. Someone might have sung a slightly flat note, someone else might have coughed, but Elvis heard it and it tickled his funny bone. He tried to sing his next line, but a giggle slipped out. This set off a chain reaction. The Imperials, who were trying to maintain their composure, saw Elvis laughing and started to lose it themselves. One of them snorted, which made Elvis laugh even harder. The beautiful four-part harmony they were creating collapsed into a jumble of chuckles and wheezes. Elvis tried to regain control. "Okay, fellas, let's get serious now," he said, but he was still laughing as he said it. They started the song again from the top. They got through the first verse, and then the same thing happened. Someone would make a funny face or sing a word in a silly way, and the whole thing would fall apart again. The producer, sitting in the control booth, was getting frustrated, but he also knew that you couldn't force these moments. The laughter, while unprofessional, was also a sign that the group was comfortable with each other. They were connecting on a human level, not just a musical one. Finally, after several false starts and a lot of laughter, they managed to get through a complete take. And it was perfect. The laughter had cleared the air. It had relaxed everyone. The final master take has a warmth and a joy to it that might not have been there if they hadn't spent 10 minutes acting like schoolboys. The outtakes, which have since been released, are a wonderful document. You can hear the transition from serious singers to a group of friends sharing an inside joke. It's a reminder that even the most sacred music is made by ordinary people. And sometimes, the path to creating something truly divine is through a moment of completely human and very silly laughter. Number 7, how can you split your pants and the room at the same time? During the 1970s, Elvis's stage wear consisted of elaborate, custom-made jumpsuits. These were often tight-fitting and not designed for the strenuous karate-style moves he incorporated into his act. A wardrobe malfunction was not a matter of if, but when. He learned to turn these embarrassing moments into comedy. This particular incident happened not in a recording studio, but during the rehearsals for his Aloha from Hawaii concert in 1973. The rehearsals were being filmed and recorded, effectively turning the concert arena into a massive studio. The pressure was enormous. This was going to be the first concert broadcast globally via satellite. Elvis was on stage, running through his set with the TCB band. He was wearing a white jumpsuit, one of the many designed for the show. He was in high spirits, feeling good about the music. He launched into a high-energy performance of Suspicious Minds, a song that required a lot of movement. He came to the part of the song where he would do a dramatic deep lunge, a move he had practiced thousands of times. He crouched down low, arms outstretched, and then he heard a loud ripping sound. The entire back seam of his jumpsuit had split open, from his neck down to his belt. For a moment he froze. The band kept playing, unsure of what had happened. The camera crew zoomed in. In front of a live rehearsal audience and the entire crew, the king of rock and roll had split his pants. He could have been embarrassed. He could have been angry. He could have stopped the show. Instead, he stood up slowly, a look of mock horror on his face. He turned his back to the audience to show them the full extent of the damage. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. Elvis grabbed the microphone. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with comedic timing, "I just blew out the seat of my pants." He then started to laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that showed he was in on the joke. He handed the ripped jumpsuit to one of his assistants, who draped a cape over his shoulders to preserve his modesty. He didn't miss a beat. He continued the rehearsal, wearing the cape, making jokes about the incident between songs. He had taken a moment of potential humiliation and turned it into a moment of connection with his band and his audience. He had shown them that he didn't take himself too seriously. This incident, captured on film, is a masterclass in stagecraft. It demonstrates Elvis's incredible ability to think on his feet and control a room. He understood that authenticity was more powerful than perfection. By laughing at himself, he made the audience love him even more. It was a goof, an accident, but his handling of it was pure genius. It was a reminder that the show wasn't just about the songs, it was about the charisma of the man singing them, a man who knew how to be a king even when his pants were split wide open. Number 6, what was the doghouse and how did you get out? Elvis rarely fired members of his band or inner circle outright. Instead, he would use a form of psychological punishment known as the doghouse. This involved giving the offending person the silent treatment, sometimes for days, even while working closely with them in the studio. Getting out of the doghouse often required a grand humorous gesture. The studio was a place of intense focus, but it was also a social club. The same group of musicians and friends were together for long hours, day after day. Inevitably, someone would do something to annoy Elvis. It could be a minor offense, making an off-color joke he didn't like, beating him in a game of touch football, or even just being in a bad mood. When this happened, Elvis would put them in the doghouse. He would completely ignore their existence. He wouldn't speak to them, look at them, or acknowledge them in any way. For the person on the receiving end, it was brutal. They were ostracized from the group, living in a bubble of silence while everyone else went about their business. During a recording session, this could be particularly difficult. Imagine being a guitarist and needing to ask the singer about a chord change, but he refuses to even look in your direction. The tension in the room would become unbearable. Getting out of the doghouse was a tricky business. A direct apology rarely worked. Elvis didn't want contrition, he wanted entertainment. The best way to earn his forgiveness was to do something so funny or outrageous that he couldn't help but laugh. On one occasion, a member of the Memphis Mafia had been in the doghouse for nearly a week. The mood in the studio was grim. The guy was desperate. He knew he had to do something big. He found out that a local costume shop rented out gorilla suits. He had an idea. The next day, during a break in the recording session, the studio doors burst open. In walked a full-sized gorilla. It beat its chest, grunted, and started doing a clumsy dance in the middle of the studio. The band and crew were stunned into silence. The gorilla then walked directly up to Elvis, who was sitting in his chair looking bemused. The gorilla got down on one knee, took off its mask, and revealed the face of the banished friend. He looked up at Elvis with a pleading expression. For a long moment, Elvis just stared at him. The entire room held its breath. Then, a slow smile spread across Elvis's face, and he erupted in laughter. He laughed so hard he fell out of his chair. The prank was so absurd, so over the top, that the anger was completely forgotten. The man was welcomed back into the fold. The doghouse door was open. This strange ritual was another one of Elvis's control mechanisms. It was a way of enforcing the unwritten rules of his world. But it was also a reflection of his own emotional immaturity. Instead of addressing conflicts directly, he created these elaborate games. The doghouse was a testament to the bizarre, insulated world he had built, a place where the only way to solve a serious problem was to put on a gorilla suit. Number 5, can a sound engineer be a prankster? Studio engineers are typically the most serious people in the room. They are responsible for the technical aspects of the recording, a job that requires immense focus and precision. However, working with Elvis for years could corrupt even the most professional engineer. Bill Porter, one of RCA Nashville's top engineers, occasionally got in on the action. The relationship between Elvis and his engineers was one of mutual respect. He trusted them to capture his sound, and they were in awe of his natural talent. But after hundreds of hours spent together in a small, windowless room, a certain level of familiarity developed. While Bill Porter knew Elvis's sense of humor, well, he knew Elvis loved slapstick comedy and silly sound effects. During a particularly long and tedious session for a movie soundtrack, Porter decided to liven things up. The band was in the middle of a take. It was a slow, boring song. Elvis was just going through the motions. Porter, sitting at the massive mixing console, had an idea. He had access to a library of sound effects on a separate tape machine. He discreetly queued up a classic cartoon bowing sound, the kind you hear when a character gets hit on the head with a mallet. He waited for the perfect moment. There was a pause in the music just before Elvis was about to sing a line. Porter hit the play button on the sound effects machine. The loud, comical bowing echoed through the studio's powerful playback speakers. The entire band jumped. The take screeched to a halt. For a second, there was confused silence. Then, Elvis's laugh boomed from the vocal booth. He knew instantly that it was a prank. He looked through the glass at the control room where Bill Porter was trying and failing to keep a straight face. "Porter, you son of a gun," Elvis yelled, still laughing. The tension of the boring session was broken. Everyone started talking and joking. The prank had worked. It had injected a much-needed dose of fun into a dreary workday. This was a rare occurrence. The engineers usually had to be the adults in the room, the ones who kept things on track despite the chaos. But this moment showed the deep camaraderie that had developed between Elvis and his technical crew. Porter knew he was taking a risk. If Elvis had been in a bad mood, the prank could have backfired spectacularly. But he read the room correctly. He understood that sometimes the best way to get a good performance out of Elvis was to make him laugh first. It was a small act of rebellion from behind the mixing board, a reminder that even in the King's Court, the technicians occasionally got to play the jester. Number 4, how did food fights fuel creativity? The recording studio for Elvis was not just a place of work. It was a dining room. He had full meals catered for himself and the entire crew, often in the middle of the night. This constant supply of food provided another opportunity for pranks and goofs. A flying sandwich was almost as common as a guitar lick. The sessions for the From Elvis in Memphis album at American Sound Studio in 1969 were legendary for their creative output. They were also legendary for their messiness. The studio was a small, cramped space, and it was always filled with plates of barbecue, sandwiches, and bottles of soda. And Elvis was a notoriously playful eater. He would often start small-scale food fights with the members of the Memphis Mafia. It might begin with him flicking a piece of bread at someone. If they retaliated, it would escalate quickly. Soon, entire sandwiches would be flying across the room. The musicians who were trying to focus on the music often got caught in the crossfire. Your guitarist, Reggie Young, recalled looking down at his prized Fender guitar and finding a glob of mayonnaise on it. He had to stop the session to carefully clean his instrument. On one occasion, Elvis and his cousin, Billy Smith, got into a full-blown war with hot dogs. They were throwing them at each other, and the battle spilled out from the lounge area into the main studio. A stray hot dog, covered in mustard, reportedly hit the back of producer Chips Moman's head while he was listening to a playback. Moman, a no-nonsense professional, was not amused. He had to halt the session and lay down the law: no more food fights in the studio itself. This behavior might seem unprofessional and childish, but it served a purpose. These were long, grueling sessions. They would often start in the evening and go until dawn. The food fights were a release of energy, a way to blow off steam and combat the fatigue. They were also a bonding experience. It was a way for this group of men, isolated from the outside world, to connect and have fun. The shared silliness created a sense of camaraderie that translated into the music. The recordings from this period are famously loose, soulful, and full of life. Part of that energy came from the fact that the musicians felt like they were part of a team, a slightly dysfunctional family that occasionally threw hot dogs at each other. The chaos of the food fights mirrored the creative chaos that was producing some of the best music of Elvis's career. Number 3 was hiding the king's toys, an act of war. Elvis's pranks were usually a one-way street. He was the prankster, and everyone else was a potential target. Retaliation was risky. However, on rare occasions, the band and crew would conspire to get him back. The safest way to do this was not to prank him directly, but to prank his equipment, specifically his prank equipment. By the early 1970s, the water pistol fights had become a regular, if dreaded, part of the studio routine. Elvis had a favorite water pistol, a large, powerful model that he considered his personal sidearm. He would keep it close by at all times, ready for an impromptu battle. The band, tired of getting soaked and worried, about their instruments, decided to take action. While Elvis was absorbed in a vocal take, one of the musicians snuck over to his chair and grabbed the prized water pistol. He then passed it along to another band member, who hid it inside the kick drum of Ronnie Tutt's drum set. When Elvis finished the take and came out of the booth, he immediately reached for his water pistol. It was gone. A look of confusion, then suspicion crossed his face. "All right, who's got my gun?" he asked. The entire room feigned ignorance. The musicians all looked at each other, shrugging their shoulders. Elvis knew he was being played. He started a search, looking under chairs and behind amplifiers. He was getting more and more frustrated, which was exactly what the band wanted. The standoff lasted for about 10 minutes. The session was at a complete standstill. Finally, Elvis looked at Ronnie Tutt. "Ronnie," he said, "you got a funny look on your face." Ronnie, a good-natured man, couldn't hold it in any longer. He started to laugh. He walked over to his drum set, removed the front drum head, and pulled out the water pistol. He presented it to Elvis like a peace offering. Elvis snatched it back, but he wasn't angry. He was smiling. He had been beaten at his own game. This small act of collective rebellion was significant. It was a rare moment when the power dynamic in the room shifted. For a few minutes, the band was in control. It was a harmless prank, but it was a way for them to assert a small amount of independence. It showed that their relationship with Elvis was not just one of employees and an employer. There was a genuine, if sometimes strange, friendship there. A friendship where you could get away with hiding the king's favorite toy as long as you were prepared for the watery revenge that was sure to follow. Number 2, did a mistake create a legend? Many of Elvis's goofs were unintentional lyrical mistakes that he would make in the middle of a take. Instead of stopping, he would often try to power through, sometimes replacing the forgotten words with nonsense or laughter. These mistakes, captured on tape, provide some of the most human and endearing moments of his recorded legacy. One of the most famous examples occurred during the recording of Wooden Heart in 1960. The song contains a verse sung in German. Elvis did not speak German and had to learn the lines phonetically. During one of the early takes, he got to the German part and his mind went completely blank. He couldn't remember the words. Instead of stopping and asking for a lyric sheet, he just started singing gibberish. He sang a string of nonsense syllables in a vaguely German accent. The band, confused but professional, kept playing. After a few lines of this, he realized how ridiculous it sounded and started to laugh. He couldn't finish the take. The tape captures him cracking up, saying, "I can't do it. This wasn't a prank." It was a genuine mistake. But his reaction to it, the open and unashamed laughter, was pure Elvis. Another classic example is a live recording of One Night. He gets to a crucial line and forgets the words. There's a moment of silence where the lyric should be. And then, instead of panicking, Elvis just hums the melody loudly and off-key. He then starts laughing at his own mistake. The audience, rather than being disappointed, cheers him on. These moments were important because they shattered the myth of the perfect, untouchable superstar. They showed that he was fallible. He forgot words, he made mistakes, he laughed at himself. This made him relatable. In the highly controlled and polished world of pop music, these mistakes were a breath of fresh air. They were moments of pure, unscripted reality. The record company would never have released these takes as the official masters. But for collectors and fans, these outtakes are treasures. They are the sound of a man who was not afraid to be human, even when the tape was rolling. They are a reminder that sometimes, the most beautiful moments in music are the ones that happen by mistake. Number 1, who really controlled the recording session? The final prank is not a single event, but an ongoing psychological game Elvis played with his producers. Producers like Chet Atkins, Steve Sholes, and Felton Jarvis were officially in charge of the recording sessions. But the real leader was always Elvis, and he used his pranks and goofs as a tool to maintain that control. A recording session is a structured environment. The producer is supposed to be the director, guiding the artists and musicians to achieve a specific sound. But when Elvis walked into a room, that structure dissolved. He became the sun, and everyone else orbited around him. He would often use his humor to undermine the producer's authority in a playful but effective way. If a producer was getting too technical or giving too many instructions, Elvis would derail the conversation with a joke or a non sequitur. He would start a water fight, he would throw a firecracker, he would do anything to break the formal structure and reassert his own, more chaotic way of doing things. Felton Jarvis, who produced most of Elvis's work from the mid-60s until his death, had a particularly challenging relationship with him. Felton was a brilliant producer, but he also understood that his primary job was to keep Elvis happy and creative. He became more of a facilitator than a director. There's a famous outtake where Felton is trying to give Elvis some direction from the control booth. Elvis, that was great, but can you try it one more time and hit that note a little harder? Elvis's reply, dripping with mock sincerity, comes back over the speaker. Felton, are you telling me how to sing? The comment is followed by laughter from the band, and Felton has no choice but to laugh along. The point has been made. As Elvis will sing it the way he wants to sing it. The pranks were an extension of this. They were a constant reminder to everyone, including the man from the record company paying the bills, that this was Elvis's show. The sessions ran on his schedule. They started when he felt like it, and they ended when he got bored. The creative direction was dictated by his mood. In the end, all the goofs, the pranks, the guns, and the go-karts were not just random acts of a spoiled star. They were the methods of a man who felt trapped by his own image and his business obligations. The studio was the one place where he could be completely, utterly himself. He used his sense of humor, however bizarre or disruptive, as his primary tool for shaping his world. He couldn't control the movies he had to make or the songs he sometimes had to sing, but he could control the atmosphere in which they were created. And he chose to create in a world of joyful chaos, a world where a perfect take could be ruined by a laugh and a masterpiece could be born from the ashes of a prank. He was the king, and the studio was his court, a court where the jester and the monarch were one and the same.